Hello and welcome to the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm your host Daniel Watkins, and today's episode will be a little different as I take you around the staterooms of Alnwick Castle. During the time of the 4th Duke of Northumberland, in the 1850s and 1860s, the interiors of Alnwick Castle were restored, transforming the castle as it had been into a palace in the style of the Italian Renaissance. The rooms were filled with Italian decorative features, and the walls with incredible works of art. The rooms today still display highlights from the castle's collections of paintings, ceramics, furniture and more, and the same rooms are still used as the family home of the present Duke and Duchess of Northumberland. Please note that this podcast was recorded in the staterooms themselves, and so the sound quality may change as we move from room to room. I hope this episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast will give you a sense of the staterooms as we travel around them, wherever you may be listening. If you're visiting Alnwick Castle, you might like to try this podcast as an audio guide to the rooms. Let's go inside. We'll begin our tour of the staterooms at the front door. What I see straight in front of me is a huge door knocker on which is a depiction of Neptune, the god of the sea, which was bought in the 19th century for the castle from Venice. I'll open the door now and we'll head into the entrance hall. Now we're in the entrance hall, also called the lower guard chamber, and all around me are weapons that belonged to the Percy Tenantry Volunteers. If you listen to episode 9 of this podcast, you'll hear all about the PTV, who were formed by the 2nd Duke of Northumberland at the very end of the 18th century. On the walls there are pistols, cavalry sabres, gunpowder horns, sergeant swords, bugles, halberds, and other equipment that the Percy Tenantry Volunteers would have used in their training against potential invasion from Napoleon Bonaparte. But on the wall just to the left of the door, I can see a very special sword in its own display case. This belonged to the youngest son of the 5th Duke of Northumberland, and on the 5th of November 1854, at the Battle of Inkerman, his actions later earned him a Victoria Cross medal. The sword here in the lower guard chamber has the Percy family motto, Espérance en Dieu, written on the blade. You can see the sword along with his belt and his mess kit, which includes cutlery to be used on the march. The Victoria Cross itself can be seen engraved into the castle walls on the gun terrace, put there by proud members of Henry's family. To the right of the front door, we have sections of armour that are said to have belonged to Oliver Cromwell's soldiers. In 1650, on the 3rd of September, Cromwell won a battle in Dunbar in Scotland against forces who were still loyal to the exiled King Charles II. Thousands were taken prisoner to be marched to Durham Cathedral. On the way, they were kept overnight in the grounds of Alnwick Castle. The story goes that some of the soldiers left their armour behind and continued to march the prisoners to Morpeth and then further south to Durham Cathedral itself, where they met with various fates of imprisonment, indentured servitude, and death through illness and negligence. What we have here is a breastplate, a backplate, and a helmet. Whether these were part of the Battle of Dunbar, we might never know for sure, but they're very impressive and make a great centrepiece to the display of weapons all around the lower guard chamber. There are hundreds of weapons in this room, but the arrangement is something unique to Alnwick Castle. The weapons are displayed in patterns, in ordered systems, and they're a form of decoration in this room. Behind the weapons, the walls are plain stone, but as we go through the door to the grand staircase, things become more palatial, and they become closer to the Italian Renaissance, the period that the 4th Duke of Northumberland wanted to emulate as he restored the castle from the mid-1850s until the mid-1860s. Before we walk up the grand staircase, on my right is a statue of a seated duchess. Louisa Drummond, later Louisa Percy, was the 6th Duchess of Northumberland. She lived here at the castle towards the end of the 19th century, and this statue sees her sat with her chair decorated by lions, snakes, birds, and other animals. She looks up towards the staircase itself, and that's where we'll head now. As I walk up the stairs, on either side of me is Italian Carrara marble. Down below me are huge slabs of local stone that were used to create this grand staircase, which was a new addition to the castle for the 19th century. And as we walk further up, on my right are more members of the Percy family. Dressed in his Knights of the Garter robes is Hugh Percy, the 10th Duke, who was here at the castle from 1940 until 1988. His parents are next to him, Alan Percy, the 8th Duke, and Helen, his Duchess, who's dressed in the coronation robes she wore as the mistress of the robes to the Queen at the coronation of King George VI in 1937. There is another portrait of Helen further up the stairs, which we'll talk about in a minute. If you look back at the top of the grand staircase, you'll see one more portrait, this one by Thomas Gainsborough, painted in the 18th century, depicting the 1st Duke of Northumberland. You'll find out more about him in episode 5 of the podcast. The 1st Duke here looks very important, very proud, and is probably a key portrait that you might miss as you walk up the stairs of the castle. I'm at the top of the stairs now, and I'm going to turn right to see the castle chapel. The chapel is another area that was created by the 4th Duke of Northumberland in the 19th century. There have been chapels here at the castle for hundreds of years, though they haven't always been in the same place. This chapel is attached to the main keep, not a separate building, as it might have been in the medieval period. And we're standing on the top level. Looking down over the balcony, I can see about half a dozen rows of pews where people would sit to hear services. On the walls all around us are displayed tapestries from the 16th century portraying biblical stories. Above us, a ceiling vaulted and decorated with stars, and on the wall to my right, here on the top level of the chapel, is a painting of the Nativity by Giovanni Lanfranco. The chapel is one of the most peaceful areas of Alnwick Castle. The stained glass of the windows reflects the light beautifully throughout the day, and it's a room not to be missed if you come here and visit the staterooms. We'll leave the chapel now and head to the upper guard chamber. I mentioned the lower guard chamber before. As we go up the stairs, that name changes, but the function really remains the same. The guard chamber was a room for welcoming and receiving guests. The echo in my voice, which you might have heard through this recording, will probably get more pronounced in this room because of its huge square shape and its very high ceilings. There are more reminders of the Italian style the 4th Duke wished to emulate here in the upper guard chamber. I'm standing on an Italian-style terrazzo floor. Up above me is an Italian-style ceiling, and there are works of Italian art all around the walls, some of which were collected by the 4th Duke, who was a great acquirer of artworks, particularly from Italy. One in particular is just to the left of the staircase as you enter the upper guard chamber. It's a picture called Sunset, painted by Claude Lorraine in 1636. And it shows a sunset in a fictional Roman harbour with grand buildings on the seafront, the sun lowering in the distance, the blue sky just disappearing in the foreground, and groups of people getting ready to board ships to travel to other places. The figures are one of the most interesting parts of this painting for me. There are musicians, there are families, there are people fighting, there are people with their hands on their swords, and people getting the boat ready. There's a lot of activity. The skill and the technique of the sunset itself is, in my opinion, unparalleled. It is one of my favourite paintings in the whole castle. It's one I recommend you definitely spend some time looking at when you come to visit. On the next wall are 4 paintings by an artist who's been mentioned in multiple episodes of this podcast so far, Canaletto. We have 4 views by him here in the upper guard chamber. Syon House, the London home of the Duke and Duchess, is on the top left corner of this wall, and you'll hear all about Syon in episode 10. On the top right is Windsor Castle, the home at that time of the King, but the home of the Queen today. And 2 views of Westminster Bridge are on the bottom left and right. London, as seen through an arch of Westminster Bridge, is a painting that comes up again and again as people's favourite when they come here to the castle, and it is a fantastic example of Canaletto at his best. You see the River Thames stretched out in front of you, St Paul's Cathedral in the distance, the arch of the bridge itself forming a kind of interior frame of the picture, and a little bucket hanging from a rope showing that the bridge is still under construction. Between these pictures is a full-length portrait by Sir Anthony van Dyck of a Percy ancestor, Algernon, the 10th Earl of Northumberland, who ruled over the castle estates in the 17th century. He's painted here by Van Dyck as the Lord High Admiral of the Royal Navy, with all the various regalia resting on an anchor and looking about as important as he could hope to be. There are more recent members of the Percy family seen in this room, however. In the corner to the right of Algernon's portrait is a much more recent member of the Percy family, dressed as a page to the Queen from the opening of Parliament ceremony in 1996. To his right is Helen Percy, who we mentioned just earlier, painted by the same artist, Philip de Laszlo, who painted her in 1937 in her coronation robes. This larger portrait shows Helen 20 years earlier, in the 1910s, just before she became the Duchess of Northumberland. On either side of her are 2 Italian statues, brought here again in the middle of the 19th century. On the left, as you look at them, is Justice, holding her scales in one hand and a sword in the other. Next to her, on our right, is Britannia, holding her trident and her shield. We'll move through the guard chamber now to rooms used more frequently by the Percy family today, the ante-library and the library. The ante-library is one of the staterooms that has undergone a full refurbishment and restoration in the time of the present generation of the Percy family. The ante-library is the most recent of these rooms to be restored, with work taking place at various points in 2020 and 2021. The ante-library worked as a waiting room for the main library itself, and there was plenty to look at while you waited. Some of the greatest works of art in the whole castle collection are here in this room. If you listened to episode 7 of this podcast about the art of Alnwick Castle, you might have heard about the paintings by Titian we have in the collection, and 3 of them are on the wall in front of me, to the left, as I entered the ante-library. The Bishop of Rodez and his secretary are on the bottom left of the wall. Above them, a portrait of an unknown man, and on the top right, a portrait of Jesus in the crown of thorns. The other artists in this room are all Italian too. The Lady with a Lute by Parma il Vecchio is in this room, and there are 3 large fragments of a fresco or wall painting by Sebastiano del Piombo. Sebastiano was a top painter in Rome in the 1520s and 1530s, a contemporary and good friend for a long time of Michelangelo. One of his last works was to create a huge fresco for the Santa Maria della Pace church in Rome, depicting the Visitation, a key event in the life of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Mary herself is seen in the middle of our 3 fragments, which were taken from the wall of the church later on, framed, and eventually ending up in the collection of the 4th Duke of Northumberland in the 19th century. There is a helpful painting above the fresco fragments that shows how our 3 pieces would have fitted into the finished picture. Sebastiano, however, never completed every detail of this fresco, as he died before it could be finished. As I look on the opposite wall, we have the first of our large mirrors in the staterooms, which brilliantly reflect the ceilings, the light from the chandeliers, and the wall hangings, which in this room are a dark red, replacing a light blue that was here prior to the 2020 restorations. As we move through the door, we'll go into the library itself. This room is the favourite of a lot of our visitors. It's probably my favourite as well. The reason for this is that in this room are somewhere in the region of 14,000 books, collected over successive generations of the Percy family. The Wizard Earl of Northumberland, the 9th Earl, who you might have heard about in our Shakespeare episode of the podcast, was a great collector of books. He was known for his library over 400 years ago. The mother of the first Duchess, the Countess of Hertford, was a literary patron and had a very keen interest in poetry and other forms of writing. The first Duchess herself collected books as part of her museum, and the 4th Duke employed a librarian to help fill this library room. It is absolutely spectacular. The books are on 2 levels. The top level accessed by a staircase that's hidden behind the wall of the library, just to the left as you enter. And the books are on every imaginable subject, from descriptions of birds and animals to travel documents, to directories of antiquities and Roman coins, to copies of Shakespeare, Dickens, and many of the other most famous authors in British literary history. There are 3 fireplaces in the library. Each one of them has, on top of it, a bust of a particular kind of genius. The scientist Sir Isaac Newton is on one fireplace. The philosopher Sir Francis Bacon, who knew the Wizard Earl of Northumberland, is on the second fireplace. And, most suitably for a library, William Shakespeare is on the 3rd fireplace. The library also functions as the main living room for the current generation of the Percy family. So it's not just books in this room. There's modern furniture, there are beanbags, there's a television, and there are family photos all around this room. Alnwick Castle is the home of the Percy family still in the 21st century, and this room, the library, really shows that very clearly indeed. Before we leave it though, we're going to look up at the ceiling of the library, where there are panels decorated with various items that fit some of the subjects you might see in the library and some of the interests of the 4th Duke of Northumberland specifically. Italian art and culture is represented in one panel. History, travel, and the Navy are depicted in a second. Technology, science, and new innovations on the 3rd. And the 4th shows music and the arts. One of our top tips to visitors as they come through the staterooms is to have a quick look up as they visit each new room, as the ceilings are some of the most spectacular decorations in the whole castle. They were created by the Alnwick School of Carving, a group of local craftsmen put together by the 4th Duke to create the Italian-style wood carvings around the castle rooms. Not just the ceilings, but window shutters, doors, picture frames, and other items were created by the Alnwick School, taught by a master carver from Florence, Anton Buletti. Their work gets more and more impressive as we continue through the rooms, and we hope to explore the Alnwick School of Carving a little more in a future episode of the podcast. I'm now in the saloon, also known as the music room, a room designed for entertaining large groups of guests, and there is still a grand piano in this room that could create music for anybody visiting. We're inside some of the 14th century towers of the castle now, but still with that 19th century interior that the 4th Duke of Northumberland wanted to have. More of his ancestors are displayed in the portraits here in this room. In front of me, on the right as you enter the room, is a head and shoulders portrait of Algernon the 10th Earl, who we saw a couple of rooms ago in the upper guard chamber. Above him, his son, Jocelyn Percy, the 11th Earl, and next to him, his daughter and his wife, both of whom were named Elizabeth. When Jocelyn died in 1670, Elizabeth was his only surviving child. She was around 3 years old, and by the time she was 16, she had been married 3 times in an attempt to ensure that the Percy names, titles, and the dynasty survived. They did thanks to Elizabeth, her son, another Algernon, and her granddaughter, who became the first Duchess of Northumberland. Elizabeth's story is absolutely fascinating, and it is another that we hope to explore in the future. Down below the two Elizabeths is a portrait of Henrietta Maria, the wife of King Charles I and the Queen Consort in England, Scotland and Ireland in the 17th century. She would have been a contemporary of the 10th Earl of Northumberland, who served her husband Charles I until civil war broke out in England in the 1640s, and Algernon Percy became a high-ranking defector to the side of Parliament, who were fighting against the king. He did maintain a friendly relationship with the king on a personal level, if not a political one, and was appointed to look after the king's younger children at Sion House in the years leading up to Charles I's execution and beheading in 1649. On the other side of the large mirror that takes up the centre part of this room are more portraits. Some are of Italian noblemen, mostly from the 16th century, and below them are two paintings by William Dobson. Please listen to episode 7 about the art of Alnwick Castle to find out about how important William Dobson was to British art history. The portrait that includes Dobson himself with two of Charles I's courtiers is one of the most popular pictures in the castle, but it's not just portraits here in the saloon. There are 4 more view paintings by Canaletto. If you look behind you as you enter the saloon, you'll see 2 views of Venice. On your left will be a view of Piazza San Marco, St. Mark's Square, with its bell tower on the right-hand side of the picture. To the right of the door are the Scala dei Giganti, the giant steps, part of the Doge's Palace, just off St. Mark's Square. These pictures will have been commissioned by the first Duke of Northumberland after his grand tour around Italy and other parts of Europe as a young man. Before they were here at Alnwick Castle, they hung in his dining room at Stanwick Park in Yorkshire. Opposite them would have been 2 views of Rome, a room really designed to remind the first Duke of his time in Italy. But opposite these 2 Canalettos today are 2 views, again by him, but this time of English subjects, houses that belonged to the first Duke himself. On the right, as you look at the 2 pictures, is Northumberland House. This was in the centre of London and was an incredibly important part of the social lives of the first Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, and it continued to be important until its demolition in 1874. If you listen to episode 5 all about the first Duke and Duchess, you'll hear a little more about Northumberland House. Next to it here in this room is a painting of Alnwick Castle itself, the way it might have looked before the first Duke and Duchess restored the castle in the 18th century, turning it into this grand family home for the first time after its centuries as a medieval fortress. The castle here looks a little bit different to the way you might see it today. The terrace on which is the Alnwick cannon and other guns doesn't exist. The landscape is rougher, the river flows faster. It's clear that Capability Brown has not yet visited Alnwick. There's a tall watchtower on the keep, the central building of the castle, almost twice as tall as any other tower. If you listen to episode 12 about the castle model, you'll hear the discussion with our archivist about the existence of this tower, how tall it might have been, and the various points in time where it's recorded or not recorded. Canaletto has kept it as a really eye-catching, striking part of the castle's architecture. Whether it really looked like this, we'll never know. Canaletto himself may never have known, as he never visited Alnwick to paint this picture. He was probably given earlier pictures, drawings and prints by which to complete his painting. The saloon was restored in the year 2008. As part of that restoration, everything from the ceiling to the frieze to the wall hangings to the carpet that I'm currently standing on was looked after extremely well. The room next door was given the same care in 2009. This was the drawing room, and inside the drawing room are some of the most important pieces of furniture in the castle collection. Even the doors between the rooms are beautifully decorated. As you leave the saloon, you'll see the doors, are decorated with wooden carvings of the heads of lions. As you enter the drawing room, these carvings change to the mythical figure of Medusa. I mentioned Capability Brown earlier, and from here in the drawing room, the windows really provide a fantastic view of the landscape work he undertook in the 18th century to the land known as the pastures north of the castle. The perimeter of trees and the landscape itself are all part of the work that Brown did for the first Duke and Duchess during their restorations. Like all the other rooms we've been to so far, the interiors of this room were redone by the fourth Duke in the middle of the 19th century. There's more of his Italian art collection with portraits by Andrea del Sarto, religious pictures by Guido Reni, and a landscape not by an Italian but by one of the most famous British artists, J.M.W. Turner. This picture is just to your left as you enter the drawing room. It's a view of a Greek temple on an island as it looked in Turner's day in the early 1800s. The picture was created to be one of a pair which were exhibited together in around 1816 or 1817. The two views were of the same temple at different points in its history, but the two pictures were separated soon afterwards, and the modern painting was later acquired by the fourth Duke. This is a picture by Turner during the time in his career where he focused on details, where he tried to be a little more in his style like Claude Lorraine, who we mentioned a few rooms ago. It's a painting you can really get lost in. In the centre of the room, in an alcove, is the Five Senses table. Commissioned by the fourth Duke at around the end of 1853, it took approximately 11 years to complete, and it's a marquetry table. The decoration of the woodwork on the top of this table is unlike anything else you'll see in the castle. And it's known as the Five Senses table because as I walk around it, I can see four male heads depicting smell, hearing, taste, and touch. There's a female figure wearing glasses in the centre of the table who represents sight. All around are images of nature and of classical mythology. Griffins, snakes, cats, mice, and plant life are all around this table. There's even a couple of dragons. That table is definitely something to see when you're in the drawing room, but the stars of this room are probably the two large cabinets you'll see on either side of the mirror and fireplace. The two cabinets are known as the Cucci cabinets, named for Domenico Cucci, who oversaw their construction in the late 1670s and early 1680s before they were completed and delivered to their original owner, King Louis XIV of France, to be displayed in his personal apartments at the Palace of Versailles. They are stunningly decorated with panels created using the technique of pietradura, which took precious and semi-precious stones and used them to create works of art. There's marble decoration, there's gilding, there's fantastic woodwork on these cabinets as well. They are completely spectacular. By 1751, King Louis XV of France had sold them, and for the next 70 years, we're not entirely sure what happened to them. They survived the French Revolution, and in the 1820s, re-emerged. Early in that decade, they were acquired by the third Duke of Northumberland, and eventually ended up here at Alnwick Castle, where they remain two of the most important pieces, not just in this collection, but perhaps anywhere you might visit. They're absolutely a must-see if you're in the staterooms of the castle, and we hope to be able to bring you an episode all about these cabinets, their history and the mysteries around them in the future. We'll continue our tour by entering the State Dining Room. Here we are in the dining room, another huge space with a very high ceiling, so again you might hear the echo in my voice a little bit more strongly here in this room. And as I stand at the entrance to the dining room, straight in front of me is the dining table itself, still used on a regular basis. If you visit the dining room, the table is always beautifully set, and if you came here for dinner, your attention would probably be drawn to the spectacular fireplace that's behind the table. It's decorated with Percy family heraldry, images of birds and nature, and classical imagery as well. It's the biggest, most ornate and most detailed fireplace in the castle, and up above it, your attention would then be drawn to the portraits of the first Duke and Duchess. I've mentioned them a few times as we've gone around these rooms, two of the most important figures in Alnwick Castle's history, and they have a particularly special Alnwick School of Carving picture frame around their portraits. Above them is one of the School of Carving's greatest works, the armorial ceiling. It's known as the armorial ceiling because it displays coats of arms, heraldry, badges and symbols of the Percy family and the baronies that have belonged to them for nearly 1,000 years. Each panel is intricately carved, and in the centre is an octagon with Percy lions and all of the symbols of the family combined. That tip to look up when you visit a new stateroom here at Alnwick Castle has never been more important than when you're here in the dining room. It is really very impressive. It's not just the first Duke and Duchess who have their portraits in this room, though. There are nearly 500 years of Percy family history represented on the walls of the dining room. We have some of the Earls of Northumberland, including Thomas, the 7th Earl, who was beheaded by Queen Elizabeth I in 1572. The Wizard Earl is here as well. There are Duchesses of Northumberland in this room, as well as Dukes. In the far corner, as you enter, you'll see ahead of you a portrait of a lady wearing a large black hat with a huge feather in it. This is Charlotte, the 3rd Duchess of Northumberland, who you might have heard in our episode about Syon House due to her role as governess to Princess, later Queen Victoria. In this room is a very special item that was given to Charlotte after the years she spent as the Vicereine of Ireland. Her husband, the 3rd Duke, was serving as Lord Lieutenant or Viceroy, and Charlotte went to Dublin with him. She did a lot of good works in Ireland and was well respected even by the people who politically disagreed with her husband. And when she left, she was presented with an item known as the Northumberland vase or the Hibernia vase. It depicts Hibernia playing a harp with Irish wolfhounds, an Irish stag, and various other imagery to remind her of Ireland. And it's still displayed here at the castle nearly 200 years later. Next to it is an item that belonged to her husband, Hugh Percy, the 3rd Duke, a ceremonial sword of honour given to him when he was appointed the ambassador to King George IV at the coronation of the new King of France in 1825. The Duke attended as the King's representative and had to look as important and regal as he possibly could. With this sword decorated with jewels, a message of gratitude from the King engraved on its hilt, he definitely would have looked the part. Some of the more recent members of the family here in the dining room are the 7th Duke and Duchess, who would have lived here at the castle at the very beginning of the 20th century. The 7th Duchess, Edith, had died just before the outbreak of the First World War. Her husband, the 7th Duke, lived throughout the years of that war and saw around 100 members of castle staff go off to serve and fight, including 2 of his sons. He did whatever he could to make provisions for their families and the people they left behind here in Alnwick, and kept everybody's jobs open for them when they returned. Many of those soldiers survived the war, did come back to the castle. Some of them continued to work here for another 20 or 30 years after that. Below his portrait, which is to the far left as you enter the dining room, is a gaming table. This looks very similar to a modern roulette table. It is slightly different, as it's decorated not with red and black, but with the letter E and the letter O. E stands for evens, O stands for odds, and the game was known as EO, or E and O. It was a game that was very popular with the 1st Duke of Northumberland, who had this gaming table made for him for Northumberland House. Before we leave the dining room, we'll walk back to the far end of the room, towards the exit, and we'll see on the left a collection of sticks made by a stick dresser, someone who worked on the Northumbrian craft of stick dressing, a tenant of the 10th Duke of Northumberland known as Norman Tulip. Tulip was one of the greatest stick dressers in Northumberland. He taught many others, he displayed at county shows, and he gave sticks as gifts. They're decorated with local wildlife, They show peacocks, snakes, herons, sheep, and everyone has their favourite stick in this collection. Norman Tulip died in 1995, but his sticks are still on display here at the castle to show some of the incredible local craftsmanship you'll find here in this part of the country. From Northumberland, though, we're going to move over to Germany to look at the Meissen porcelain that's on display in the China Gallery of the castle. The China Gallery began as a servants' corridor. It stretches the length of one side of the castle from one end of the staterooms to the other, and so it was a convenient way for servants in the 19th century and the early 20th century to get from one part to another without having to travel through the staterooms themselves. It later became a picture gallery, and then in the mid-2000s it was changed to a display of some of the porcelain services that have been collected by the family over the centuries. There are four main services in this China Gallery. The two I'll focus on are both from the Meissen factory in Germany. One is known as the Northumberland or the Hanbury-Williams service, created in the middle part of the 18th century and then later acquired by the first Duke of Northumberland, according to the story, in a lottery. He bought his ticket and he won the service. There are some really fascinating pieces of porcelain here in the very early days of European manufacture. My favourite will be found at the far end of the gallery, and it's a piece that shows in the middle of it a rhinoceros, looking like they're wearing armour, with flowers and plants and insects decorating the borders of the piece. There are other amazing animals here as well. There are crocodiles, camels, snow leopards, and more. The second Meissen service comes from around 1780, and each plate and dish in this collection tells a story, or more specifically tells a fable. They're all based on Aesop's fables, and a very famous edition of those fables that was published in the 18th century, which contained illustrations that captured many people's imagination. If you visit, see how many fables you can identify. You will be able to find some of the most famous ones, like the tortoise and the hare, alongside some that you might not have heard of before. Beyond the China Gallery is an exhibition room. Exhibitions change in the staterooms fairly regularly, so if you keep returning to visit to Alnwick Castle, you might find new stories being told, new items on display, and new highlights being shown for the very first time. Beyond that, as we leave the staterooms, we walk through the below stairs corridor, a corridor that would have been used by the butlers and other members of the household staff. On either side are photographs of members of the household as they were in the early 1900s when King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra visited Alnwick Castle. And finally we reach the bottom of those stairs and we exit back into the castle grounds and back to the outside. I hope you've enjoyed this brief walk through the castle staterooms and the brief mentions of some of the highlights of what you'll see in there. It's hopefully evoked a little bit of how special and important these rooms are to Alnwick Castle. We're back outside in the castle grounds now, and that concludes our tour of the staterooms. I hope you've enjoyed this brief journey around the staterooms of Alnwick Castle and some of the highlights of the collections displayed there. If you visit the castle itself, there's much more to see in these rooms, as well as a series of temporary displays and exhibitions throughout our opening season. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please let us know by emailing podcast@alnwickcastle.com or contacting us on Twitter @AlnwickCastle. Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and make sure to share it with your friends. On the next episode, we'll be moving from the grandeur of the staterooms to find out more about life below stairs at Alnwick Castle. Until then, thank you very much for listening. I've been Daniel, and goodbye.